Here's your advice. Straight out of the jabroni beating, pie eating, trailblazing, eyebrow raising, entertaining the globe, never hotter, talking to two rejects from Harry Potter.
For more than a decade, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson represented something Hollywood rarely achieves: near universal approval. He was viewed as hardworking, positive, reliable, and almost immune to controversy. Studios trusted him, audiences showed up for him, and brands built campaigns around his image. By the late 2010s, he was not just a movie star, but a carefully constructed symbol of success, discipline, and motivation. That reputation did not come from a single role or moment. It was built gradually through consistency, control, and an understanding of how to sell himself as both an entertainer and a brand. Johnson's rise began long before Hollywood. After failing to make it as a professional football player, he followed his family legacy into professional wrestling. In the WWE, he transformed himself into The Rock, a persona defined by charisma, verbal confidence, and crowd control. Wrestling taught him something crucial: how to command attention and shape public perception. When he transitioned into film in the early 2000s, he did not abandon that skill. Instead, he adapted it. Early roles were limited, often typecast, but he learned quickly what audiences responded to and refined his on-screen identity around that response. By the 2010s, Johnson had perfected a formula. He played characters that were physically dominant but emotionally approachable. His films emphasized teamwork, humor, and perseverance. Whether the project was an action blockbuster or a family-friendly adventure, the message was consistent. Dwayne Johnson was safe. He would not challenge audiences, alienate demographics, or risk discomfort. This predictability worked. His films performed well globally, and his presence alone became a selling point. Studios began greenlighting projects with his name as the primary guarantee. As his movie career expanded, so did his off-screen image. Johnson carefully curated his public persona through interviews and social media. He spoke openly about discipline, failure, and self-improvement. His online presence was highly active, motivational, and carefully managed. He positioned himself as someone who had earned everything through effort and resilience. This messaging resonated strongly with audiences, especially during a period when celebrity scandals were frequent and public trust in public figures was low. Johnson appeared different. He appeared controlled. The shift began subtly. As his influence grew, so did his output. Johnson appeared in more films, more franchises, and more promotional campaigns. At the same time, he expanded aggressively into business ventures, including tequila, energy drinks, apparel, and production companies. None of this was unusual for a modern celebrity, but the scale mattered. The more he appeared, the less rare he felt. His characters began to blur together. Critics and audiences started noting that he was often playing variations of the same role, with similar dialogue, similar emotional beats, and similar outcomes. This perception did not immediately harm his success, but it planted doubt. The question shifted from, "Is The Rock good?" to, "Is this all he does?" That distinction mattered. While earlier criticism focused on the quality of individual films, the newer criticism focused on Johnson himself. His image began to feel manufactured rather than organic. The motivational speeches, the gym videos, the carefully framed humility all started to feel repetitive. For some viewers, inspiration turned into fatigue. The turning point came when Johnson attempted to step beyond being a dependable star and into being a creative power broker. That moment arrived with Black Adam, a project he had championed for years. Johnson positioned the film not just as another superhero movie, but as a reset of a major franchise. He spoke publicly about changing the hierarchy of power, implied long-term narrative control, and framed himself as a central architect of the universe surrounding the film. Expectations rose accordingly. When the film released, it performed solidly but not spectacularly. Critical reception was mixed to negative, and debates emerged over its financial success relative to its budget and marketing costs. More damaging than the numbers was the narrative shift. The project had been presented as a guaranteed win, and it was not. For the first time in years, Johnson was associated with a high-profile project that did not clearly justify the confidence surrounding it. The aura of inevitability weakened. Around the same period, Johnson's public image faced a different kind of challenge. Following devastating wildfires in Maui, he and Oprah Winfrey announced a relief fund. The intention was charitable, but public reaction was unexpectedly harsh. Critics questioned why extremely wealthy individuals were asking the public to donate instead of contributing more privately. Johnson later acknowledged that he could have handled the situation better. While the controversy did not involve criminal behavior or scandal, it created something new for his image: visible public skepticism. By this stage, the pattern was clearer. Johnson was not collapsing, he was not being canceled, but the relationship between him and the audience was changing. The automatic goodwill that once surrounded his projects was no longer guaranteed. Each new release and public move was being judged more critically, not just as entertainment, but as part of a larger brand strategy. The myth of the untouchable star was fading, and what replaced it was scrutiny. This was the beginning of a different phase of Dwayne Johnson's career. Not a fall defined by scandal, but by erosion. The erosion of trust, novelty, and belief. And in Hollywood, belief is often more fragile than success. As the goodwill surrounding Dwayne Johnson softened, the performance of his later projects began to matter more than ever. Earlier in his career, a mixed review cycle or underwhelming box office result could be absorbed without consequence because the larger narrative still worked in his favor. Now, each project was treated as a referendum on whether his formula still held value. Films that once would have passed quietly now triggered broader conversations about overexposure, creative stagnation, and whether audiences were finally losing interest in seeing the same persona repeated. This pressure became impossible to ignore when high-budget releases failed to generate the enthusiasm studios expected. Projects that relied heavily on Johnson's name as the primary draw struggled to justify their costs. The issue was not that these films had no audience, but that they no longer felt essential. The gap between production scale and cultural impact widened. When a movie star reaches a point where people assume they will catch it later, something fundamental has shifted. At the same time, Johnson's insistence on control became more visible. Reports and industry commentary increasingly highlighted how much influence he exerted over scripts, character outcomes, and franchise direction. He was known for protecting his on-screen image carefully, avoiding losses, moral ambiguity, or vulnerability. What once looked like discipline now looked like limitation. Audiences began craving risk and transformation while Johnson's characters remained static. The perception grew that he was prioritizing brand preservation over storytelling. This perception was reinforced by his public-facing messaging. Johnson continued to project optimism and resilience, but the tone increasingly felt defensive. Interviews emphasized effort, leadership, and long-term vision, often in response to criticism rather than independent of it. Instead of appearing effortlessly confident, he began to sound as though he was reassuring both the audience and himself. The difference was subtle, but noticeable. Another factor working against him was the changing industry landscape. The era that rewarded universally likable, non-threatening movie stars has weakened. Streaming platforms fragmented audiences. Social media accelerated backlash cycles. Modern viewers expect authenticity, unpredictability, and vulnerability. Johnson's persona, built on consistency and control, was shaped for an earlier moment. What once felt aspirational now risked feeling corporate. Rather than retreat, Johnson pivoted. He shifted focus toward consolidating power behind the scenes. His increased involvement in wrestling leadership, production companies, and corporate partnerships signaled a recalibration. If the audience relationship was becoming less predictable, influence and ownership offered stability. This move suggested awareness rather than denial. He was preparing for a future where box office dominance was no longer guaranteed. This strategic pivot did not mean abandoning acting, but it did mark a shift in priorities. Johnson no longer positioned himself purely as a performer chasing audience approval. He framed himself as a builder, an executive, and a long-term stakeholder. The emphasis moved from individual movie success to broader control over platforms and properties. In practical terms, this insulated him from the volatility of audience taste. Still, the core issue remained unresolved. Johnson's challenge was no longer about money, access, or opportunity. It was about relevance. Not relevance in the sense of visibility, but relevance in meaning. Audiences no longer needed him to succeed, they expected him to. An expectation is dangerous. It removes tension. It removes curiosity. When success becomes assumed, failure becomes louder. The idea of his downfall is misleading if interpreted as collapse. Johnson did not lose everything. He did not disappear. He did not face legal ruin or professional exile. What he lost was something quieter and more difficult to recover, the automatic belief that whatever he touched would be worth caring about. That belief had carried him for years, and once it weakened, everything became harder. In Hollywood, stars rarely vanish overnight. They fade through recalibration. They adjust scale, reposition narratives, and test new angles. Johnson now stands at that crossroads. He can continue delivering safe, familiar performances and remain successful in a reduced but stable way. Or he can take genuine creative risks that threaten the brand he spent years constructing. Both paths carry cost. What makes his situation notable is not how badly things went, but how subtly they changed. The public did not turn on him all at once. They questioned him. Then they doubted. Then they waited. That progression matters. It marks the difference between scandal-driven collapse and reputation erosion. Johnson's career did not break. It thinned. If an average actor experienced the same shift, it would barely be noticed. But when someone has been positioned as the most reliable star in the industry, even small cracks feel significant. Johnson once represented certainty. Now he represents transition. Whether that transition leads to reinvention or slow decline depends on decisions still ahead. The downfall of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is not a story about losing everything. It is a story about losing inevitability. And in an industry built on perception, inevitability is often the strongest currency of all.